So the goal today is to finish up the 4L80 build that we are doing for the UglyTruck Turbo 8.1 Silverado. Just some quick cliff notes to kind of get you caught back up to speed. Last time this is over a couple of videos, but we had the transmission out, found a bunch of roller bearings in the bottom, decided to rebuild it, took it apart. I have like 75%, 80% of the work done, and everything is assembled from, I believe this is the forward clutch down there and below. Fourth gear is also in place. This is a new planetary, but it's not permanently installed because I got to put it on the input shaft little assembly, and there's a bearing inside I need to swap out. But all that stuff, clearances have been checked. Everything is pretty much ready to rock and roll. And I did have to buy one more part. This is the Overrun clutch drum. This has a sun gear on the middle of it, and the sun gear on the old one was actually trashed. Not bad, but there was a couple of spots there, and maybe, I know like the surface of a lot of these teeth is just a little bit chewed up, but that's because this planetary here, this had ate up some bearings, and because the two kind of mate together like that, anything that gets in these gears is probably going to get in those as well. So we had to pick that up. I should have realized before I needed the Overrun drum. Also, when I pulled this apart, but when I pulled the Overrun apart, I didn't show you guys this on camera, but whatever sprag this is, the Overrun sprag, fourth, whatever, that was kind of chewed up and broken as well. And apparently on a 4L80, whenever you have the selector in overdrive and you're driving around and you put a lot of power down, that one sprag is responsible for holding one of these stationary when you're in gears 1 through 3. But if you move the selector down to manual third, then I believe this band here applies, and it basically helps out the job that this sprag is doing. I don't know how it all works. There's a bunch of different combinations of gears and stuff going on in these transmissions, but I do know that anytime you're driving a stock 4L80 and you want to like romp on it, drop the selector down into third, because if you don't, if you leave it in overdrive, then this sprag can fail. So that's what happened. I don't think that was the main cause of failure, because this was like 85 to 90% intact, where the roller bearing that got destroyed down there on the floor, that's what I think did most of the damage on this transmission. But anyway, that's just a little quick tidbit for 4L80 owners. Drop it down into third gear. So we got a new Overrun clutch drum. The process for today, I'm going to start out with this guy. We'll put the new piston in. These use a bonded piston. Get that lubed up and get that stuck in there. Put the new clutches and steels in, the return spring. That'll go back on to hold it all in place. Put it together with a new planetary. I do want to take, this is the old one, but there's a roller bearing. Where is it? Yeah, way down on the inside, right there at the tip of my finger. I'll put a new one of those in. And then finally, the input shaft, I've got to swap out. There's 4 of these Teflon sealing rings, 2 there on the end. These, I've never done them. They're a pain in the butt, supposedly, so we'll give that a shot. And then once all that is together, we'll put the whole assembly in the case. I'll go through the pump real quick, put some new gears in that, and then finally, the valve body. I still have a few changes I'm going to make. I'm going to get rid of that, not Sonax, the Transgo pressure relief valve. I'm going to get rid of that. And then hopefully we should be ready to put this thing back together and get it in the truck. That's the goal for today, so let's get started. So we're getting started here by putting a little bit of lube on the inside of this drum. That'll just kind of help the piston go in a little bit easier. Now you will notice here I am using Vaseline instead of the blue Transgoo assembly lubricant. And the reason for that is the blue stuff, it's a little bit on like the thicker and stickier side of things, where the Vaseline is a little bit thinner. And it just seems to make the seals go in a lot easier. It's slipperier. I don't know exactly what you'd describe it as, but it'll still dissolve in the transmission fluid when you first fire it up the same way that the other assembly lubricant will. Now we're just going to compress the return spring, use a snap ring to kind of hold it onto the hub of the clutch. Pretty basic transmission stuff here. And a few of you guys had asked whether or not I actually soaked the frictions before putting them in the transmission. I didn't show this every time, but I always soak them in the ATF for about 5-10 minutes or so, just enough where they get a little bit of fluid in there and they're not just dry when you start it up for the very first time. There are 3 clutches and 3 steels in this Overrun drum, or whatever it's called. 1 thick retainer and 1 snap ring, just kind of checking clearance there, making sure there's room for the clutches to move. Now here's the tricky part. We're actually taking apart the planetary, and the reason why it's tricky is because, look, as you just saw, a little needle bearing actually fell out of one of the planet gears. Now this is fairly simple to put back in when the time comes, but it's simple, but it's tricky. So you just gotta have patience. There's the old bearing coming out. There's the new one getting lubed up and kind of stuck into place. And what I do here, this is kind of similar to like the needle bearings on a U-joint cap. You just got to put a bunch of grease on the inside of the gear and then just one by one lay the little roller bearings in there. And you can kind of see I've got a third of them in there or so. And once you have it filled up, just make sure they're all straight, make sure there's no gaps, because if you just pull this apart like without paying attention, they might fall on the table and you might lose one. So just make sure they're all in there, there's no gaps. And that grease just kind of holds them in place while you get the new center pin just pushed in. There's a special little alignment retainer that helps those little axles from spinning around, and that's held in with a snap ring just on the top. Here we're putting the sprag in place. These are a little bit sensitive. Like if you just manhandle them, you can probably pop the little rollers out. So just be very gentle with the sprag. And then when you're dropping the planetary into the clutch, just kind of, spinning around a couple times and make sure you get the splines through all 3 friction discs. It does take a little bit, but just kind of spin it back and forth, take your time, and just don't force it, because if you do, you'll probably break something. Then I'm just going to kind of double check the depth with the input shaft. So I'm still trying to get down all the names for all these parts, but I'm pretty sure this is the Overrun and Overdrive assembly that's going to go in the front of the transmission, and we're all put back together. These little guys right here, that takes a little bit of fiddling just to make sure the little needle bearings don't fall out. Not a huge deal. We've got the sprag in there. That is brand new once again, because the old one had kind of disintegrated a little bit. And this, I just kind of check the clearance to make sure that it goes on. Well, here, I can maybe... No, I can't do that with one hand. But I just slid it on the input shaft to make sure the clutches were all the way engaged. That little snap ring groove right there is just kind of barely peeking out of the top of that sun gear or whatever that's called. So I know that my 3 clutch packs are all the way engaged, and so we got one more cluster ready to go. And now it's time to move on to the input shaft. So there are 4 sealing rings, well 5 technically, but the 5th one's like an O-ring. There are 4 Teflon sealing rings that we need to replace on here just to kind of make sure we have pressure going where it should. And these are apparently resizable. I've never messed around with these, so this will be kind of fun. But basically what you got to do is, because it's not like a rubber O-ring that can just kind of stretch. They're a little bit more rigid, but what you do is you put these over like, say, a funnel or something tapered to kind of stretch them out a little bit, and then they stay stretched. So then you can kind of slide them over the shaft. But then what you got to do is actually squish them back down. And kind of the method that I've seen a lot of people use is you take like some electrical tape, wrap it around there once or twice, and then just take a worm gear hose clamp, just kind of squeeze it down, and apparently that'll squish that little ring back in the groove exactly like it's supposed to do, and then we can reassemble the shaft. So that's kind of next on the to-do list. Like I said, never done it before, but how hard can it be, right? Famous last words. So first things first, you've got to get the old sealing rings off the shaft. Now you could just cut these, but I kind of wanted to play with one just to see how it stretches and see how it can be worked back and forth without damaging it. So just kind of used a little flat blade screwdriver, just kind of work it around. And surprisingly, even though it feels like rigid plastic, it's actually pretty flexible and kind of stretchy. I'm gonna leave the obvious references out here, but you get the idea. You just gotta kind of expand the sealing ring to make it a little bit larger so it can slide over the input shaft. And once the ring is expanded, just kind of take your time, work back and forth. Don't force it, because you don't really want to tear this brand new seal. That definitely would allow a fluid leak. So just take your time, work it down into the groove, and then repeat the process for the second one. Stretch it out over the funnel, tapered punch, whatever you have available. Make sure to use lots of grease on here just so everything slides in place like it should. The electrical tape will protect the seal from the sharp edges of the hose clamp. So I'm just going to kind of lightly tighten the hose clamp, making sure I can spin the sealing ring back and forth so nothing's like folded over on itself. And it was actually pretty easy to kind of squish that sealing ring back down into the groove. So as always, take your time here. All right, on the larger ceiling rings here, I actually didn't have a hose clamp that would fit these. I probably could have gone to the store and got one, but instead I realized you can actually just slide the input shaft into the stator. Now there's a nice tapered receiver, and as long as you just very gently wiggle and push the shaft into place, it'll actually compress the ceiling rings exactly where they belong to the perfect size. One more thing you guys asked about, how much cleanup work did I do? On any bushing surface, just take a red Scotch-Brite pad or something, just kind of scuff it up. And once it's clean, so there's no more metal on there, a little bit of lube, and we'll slide it in the front carrier assembly for good, and it will get held into place with the snap ring. All right, so this is the thrust bearing that I'm putting in right now that actually failed originally and caused this whole transmission to have to be rebuilt. So we've got that in there, and we have the front carrier assembly going in, and this does take a little bit of wiggling because you're lining up the fourth gear clutches on the outside around the input drum. So I think there's 4 friction discs here. You just got to kind of wiggle everything back and forth, twist it, wiggle it, whatever you got to do, and then it'll drop down into place. And then we can move on to the front pump. I actually hadn't done anything with this yet, so the first thing we got to do is clean it up because I think the trans was a little bit leaky, had a bunch of oil on the outside. So yeah, clean everything up real good, and now we're actually drilling a small hole about 55 thousandths of an inch through a specified groove on the front of the pump. Now this will let a little bit more fluid into the converter, and when you're doing this though, just make sure you vacuum out any shavings so you don't have any trash that gets picked up in the pump. Driving a new bushing in for the converter, that's fairly straightforward, but what I am going to do right here is this is called staking the bushing, where you just kind of put a little flare out, and there's a groove actually in the pump receiver, and this just kind of stops the bushing from wanting to be spun around as the converter's turning. And just make sure there's no sharp edges left over, and if there are, just hit them with a Scotch-Brite pad. New front seal, that's pretty straightforward, and that will pretty much wrap up the pump upgrades. And one more button. So this is the part of the upload where I have to mention, like, don't do what I'm doing because I don't necessarily know what I'm doing. So do your own research when you're building your transmission stuff, and don't take this as instruction to do everything exactly how I do it. But I'll just kind of explain what I'm doing, so maybe it'll come in handy. The whole sealing ring thing, when I have the white Teflon sealing rings on the input shaft here, the 2 small ones on the opposite side, you saw me use a little hose clamp on there, and that seemed to work okay. But these guys right here, I actually didn't have the right size hose clamp. So instead what I did is I just put them on the shaft, and then you can just kind of take your fingers and like work them all the way around, and that squishes it just a little bit. And then on the back side of the stator here, this is actually, the sealing rings go way inside there, and there's a nice little tapered, well, the hole is tapered on the edge, so you can actually just kind of, with light pressure, take the input shaft, just kind of wiggle it back and forth, and then it'll actually seat both of those sealing rings in there, and that'll actually compress them and size them to the spot where they have to be. Now, with the hose clamp trick on the small side, I was a little bit worried, like, well, what if I make them too small? Like, when they heat up, will they resize? I don't know how it works exactly. This is the first time I've messed with those white Teflon sealing rings. But I've seen a million people do that little hose clamp trick, and they seem to have pretty good results. I also did kind of double check the fit. The small end goes in this drum right here. This is the old worn out one, but I made sure it fits in there. It seems to be pretty tight, but definitely this sealing ring here, or these two, have a little bit tighter fit, which I feel a little bit better about. Okay, talk about drilling holes. There's a few holes that the Transgo kit recommends that you put in there. One of them is right here. It's a little bit less than a 1/16 of an inch. You can probably barely see it right in there. And then the other one, I actually didn't show you guys. It's right behind the seal. There's a converter drain back hole, which we enlarged to just a little bit over 1/4 of an inch. And so basically what that does is the little hole here provides a little more fluid volume into the converter, and the larger drain back hole here allows that fluid to be exhausted whenever it's not needed. I've seen mixed opinions on whether or not you should do those things. It's in the Transgo kit instructions. take that for what you will. That's what we did here. I figure it's probably not going to hurt anything, but will it help anything? Hard to say. So here's kind of where we're at. We have everything cleaned up and we're ready to put the pump back together. I do have some new gears here. The old ones looked pretty good. There's a few little like radial scuffs on there, but brand new set. I have everything lubed up. And the same thing here. These housing, there's like a little bit of scuffing going on there, but nothing major, nothing that'll like catch your fingernails. So we're just gonna use this pump housing once again, and I think that will be okay. So once we get the pump together, we'll get that inside the transmission. We'll check end play. That's one more thing we'll do. There's a little plastic shim that sits, well, I don't know where it sits right now. It's on the back side of this guy actually. And there's like 4 different thicknesses that they give you in the rebuild kit. If that'll stand up, I can show you. So this is the one that was included. It sits right there. And then the drum, the forwardmost drum here, kind of rides on it on that surface. So there's 4 different thicknesses, and we'll just do a quick measurement and figure out which one we need. So that's kind of where we're at. That's the status update. Let's continue on because we're nearly done. As usual, put plenty of that assembly lubricant on there just to make sure that everything is not going to scuff when you first start it up. And the pump especially, you know, if you put a little bit of grease in between there, it'll help it make suction, which will help, you know, draw up the ATF just a little bit quicker. Two halves of the pump get lined up together. Just make sure you don't scuff the brand new bushings when you're putting this in. And here, this looks like basically just a big flat band clamp, and I bought it on eBay. It's just a pump alignment tool, and you just kind of tighten up the little wing nut there, and it just makes sure both halves of the transmission pump are just lined up with each other. And when it's tight, you don't have to go nuts. Just, you know, torque the 5 or 6 bolts that hold the 2 halves of the pump together. So now we're putting it in to check thrust clearances. I don't have any gaskets or all the sealing rings on the pump yet, but this will just give me a good baseline. So I put 2 bolts in, just kind of lightly tighten them up. And then I have this little metal bar you can kind of see along the top there. That's just a spot for me to set the dial indicator. And then when you're checking end play on this, there's actually going to be 2 little stages that you have to kind of feel out. The first stage that you can see here, that's just the input shaft lifting up until the snap ring touches that drum. And the second stage, it's going to take quite a bit more force to lift it up. That's the actual end play that you're going to be measuring. And right now I had way too much. I think it was like 40 or 50 thousandths. So we'll pull the whole thing back apart and adjust the shims. Now I think in total I did this about 3 or 4 times. I didn't show you guys every single step, but the original shim right here was 90 thousandths of an inch. And the first one I tried was like 15 thousandths more, so 105 thousandths. But my final shim, I think, was like a 115. And I skipped ahead in time. This is the final shim stack going together. And there's still enough grease on there that it holds the plastic thrust bushing in place. So we'll lower the pump once again with no gasket. We'll have to account for that. But now we are, I think, at about 10 thousandths, if I recall, end play. Let's see here. Yeah, that's a little bit right around 10 thousandths of an inch. And then the gasket, I think I measured the gasket, that'll add about 7. Perfect. So my total end play up front, 17 thousandths. And now that I have it set, I'm putting the sealing rings on the pump. And I don't think I showed it here either, but just make sure you twist the ends of the seals like 180 degrees apart from each other because these are a split seal. Once again, plenty more lubricant. You want that thing to slide in there nice and easy without damaging anything. And then the final step I'm going to do here, up 2 more steps actually. One, the O-ring that seals the pump to the case, pretty straightforward. Just make sure nothing twists in there. And then I'm going to lubricate the face of the pump. There's one more flat paper seal in there. And the grease just kind of helps it stick. It's like a temporary glue because there's a million little holes in this front gasket and it would be really easy to tear it if it's not lined up properly. So just take your time, and when you drop it in the case, try to drop it straight down so you don't actually have to turn anything to get the bolts lined up. I'll start the 5 bolts by hand and then just kind of evenly pull the pump right down into place. And I don't think I showed it, but I also did double check end play once again on the front. And then measuring end play on the rear of the case. Just kind of take a pry bar, wiggle up on the back part of the output shaft. And this one is a little bit flexible, but the indicator, once it settled down, showed I had a perfect 20 thousandths of end play. And I think max on the back was like 25. When I started making this video on Monday morning, my plan was originally to have the rest of the transmission build all the way, to putting the valve body in, putting the pan on, and sealing it up in one complete video. But it's now Thursday at just after 11 a.m. for me here in Mountain Time. And I just got done editing most of the video and I realized I have about 40 minutes worth of content, which is just a bit much for a single upload. So I think I'm gonna stop things here where we got the mechanical side done, and then I'll include the valve body assembly in the next video because there are quite a few changes I'm gonna be making inside the valve body to make it do what I want it to do, or hopefully what I want it to do, because once we get this transmission in the truck, then we'll actually see if this was all worth it and if it worked, or if I'm gonna have to tear it back out and hire somebody who actually knows what they're doing to build this thing properly for me. But anyway, here's a quick sneak peek for you. This is what the transmission looks like all done. I am just waiting on a filter because that one is not correct. But just in this valve body here, there's a lot more changes that we're gonna be making to, like I said, make this thing shift how I believe it should shift. So the mechanical parts inside the transmission, quick overview, what have we done? We did the third gear mod, so we're dual feeding the direct drum. We replaced a bunch of parts, like this pile right here on the bench. This is everything that has come out of this transmission that's old or wore out. The original failure was the bearing that went right between this planet and this drum here. Both of these surfaces are gouged. These gears were chewed up, that's why these both got replaced. This one here, the little gear surface inside the sun gear, that got damaged as well. And the sprag that sits on top, this was kind of chipped up a little bit, not bad, but those were like the damage and wear items. The rest of it is just pretty basic preventative maintenance, new bearings, new washers, new bushings and seals everywhere, so the parts spin freely and hydraulic fluid goes where it's supposed to do. New clutches and steels, frictions, bands, some lip seals there. Yeah, so basically everything that you should replace on the inside of a transmission has been replaced. It's a lot of work. This has actually taken me a lot more time than I originally was anticipating, but I'm glad I'm doing this, even though I was a little bit hesitant at first because I've never really been inside an automatic transmission this deep. So I'm glad we took the time. I'm glad I read enough and learned enough to hopefully, I know it's assembled like in the right order. I just don't know if the parts are gonna do what I want them to do, but we'll find out in a little while. So in the next video, guys, we'll go over the valve body. We'll show all the little changes that we've done hydraulically and in terms of control. And then after that, we'll get it in the truck and we'll hopefully get it out on the road and do some really cool burnouts. Because remember, the high stall torque converter is the whole reason why we went through this kind of crazy journey that is definitely kind of snowballed, but that's all right. That's building trucks. That's part of the game. Thank you guys for watching. I appreciate you. Do me a favor, do those three things. Click the like button, subscribe to the channel, and drop a comment down below. All those help the channel grow and help us continue to make cool content. Visit TolmanPerformance.com if you want to support the channel further than that. We have some pretty cool t-shirts. This is one of my favorite designs. This is the Tolman family crest that we've had modified for a gearhead theme. Pretty cool. Anyway, thank you guys for watching once again. I'll catch you in a few days.